The clock read 6:17 a.m. when America's financial nervous system flatlined. Not with a bang, not with a missile strike, but with silent code that moved through fiber optic cables like poison through veins. We've been told that cyber warfare is about stolen data and hacked emails. We've been sold a fantasy that digital attacks are merely inconvenient. But that morning, the truth became brutally clear. This wasn't about privacy. It was about solvency. And when the ledger goes dark, nations don't just stumble. They bleed out. I imagine the America that existed at 6:16 a.m., the world's largest economy, processing $4 trillion in daily transactions. Credit cards swiping 17,000 times per second. Stock exchanges trading 6 billion shares before lunch. Every ATM, every gas pump, every hospital payment system humming with digital certainty. The gross domestic product stood at $28 trillion, but here's what nobody understood. Only 8% of that existed as physical currency. The rest, numbers on screens, promises in databases. It was the most powerful economy ever built, and 92% of it was pure faith in electricity and code. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. America's digital infrastructure had become a single point of failure, wrapped in complexity. The Federal Reserve processed $5 trillion daily through systems running on architecture designed in the 1970s. Banking networks communicated through protocols written when disco was king. The power grid operated on software that couldn't be updated without risking blackouts. Every system talked to every other system, creating a web so interconnected that one severed thread could unravel the entire tapestry. Efficiency had become fragility, and fragility had become a weapon. The antagonist wasn't a nation with tanks or bombers. It was lines of code, patient and invisible, planted months earlier by programmers who understood something economists had forgotten. Modern wealth doesn't exist in vaults. In the constant digital heartbeat that confirms your account balance, your mortgage, your ability to buy bread. Cut that heartbeat, and the world's richest nation becomes a country of people holding worthless plastic cards and staring at dark screens. The attack wasn't designed to steal money. It was designed to erase the system that made money real. Within 4 minutes, 3 more banks reported identical failures. By 6:25 a.m., payment processors handling 68% of American retail transactions had frozen. The malware had burrowed deep, targeting the master nodes that synchronized financial data across institutions. It didn't delete information. It scrambled the timestamps, making every transaction unverifiable. In banking, unverifiable means non-existent. $43 trillion in account balances became Schrodinger's mummy, simultaneously there and not there, with no way to prove which was true. Every traffic system connects to municipal networks. Municipal networks connect to state infrastructure. State infrastructure connects to federal systems. This virus rode those connections like a subway map, spreading from intersection controllers to power grid management in 18 minutes. By 7 a.m., substations in 6 major cities had received corrupted shutdown commands. Engineers arrived to find control systems locked behind encryption they couldn't break. The power didn't surge or spark. It simply obeyed its new instructions and died. Clean, surgical, irreversible. The first grocery stores opened at 8 a.m. to crowds that had been forming since dawn. Managers tried processing cards, but every terminal displayed the same message: connection unavailable. They switched to manual imprinters, those old-fashioned credit card sliders from the 80s. Useless. Authorization networks were gone. They announced cash only, and that's when the mathematics of collapse became visible. The average American carried $47 in physical currency. A week of groceries cost $215. The shelves held enough food to feed the city for 4 days. Do the math. 12 million people. 4 days of supplies. $47 average cash. The equation didn't end in hunger. It ended in empty shelves by noon. Hospitals declared internal disasters by 10 a.m. Backup generators kicked in. But here's the thing about modern hospitals. They don't just need power. They need data. A surgeon can operate in candlelight, but not without knowing blood type, allergies, medication history. That information lived in cloud servers now cut off from access. Doctors made decisions based on patient testimony and guesswork. Medicine had been thrown backward 60 years in 3 hours. The first preventable deaths occurred before lunch. A diabetic in Cleveland, an asthma patient in Phoenix. Complications that electronics would have caught in seconds. By noon, the economic damage had already crossed $1 trillion. Not in destroyed assets, in frozen assets. Manufacturing plants couldn't order materials. Trucking companies couldn't route shipments. The supply chain that delivered $30 billion of goods daily had seized like an engine without oil. Warehouses sat full while stores stood empty, separated by a mere 100 miles and an impassable gulf of dead logistics software. Food rotted in trucks that couldn't navigate without GPS. Medicine expired in facilities that couldn't confirm destinations. Abundance and scarcity existed simultaneously, divided by silent networks. The stock market never opened. With master clocks corrupted, synchronization became impossible. The New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, every major trading platform made the same decision: indefinite suspension. $5 trillion in daily trading volume simply vanished. No losses, no gains, just stasis. Overseas markets reacted predictably. Asian exchanges opened to bloodbaths as investors fled American assets. European markets followed. By the time London closed, $3.7 trillion in global market capitalization had evaporated. America hadn't lost money. The Federal Reserve convened emergency meetings in rooms where phones still worked on old copper landlines. The chair faced a problem no monetary policy could solve. Interest rates meant nothing when banks couldn't communicate. The Fed's balance sheet held $8 trillion in assets, and every dollar was trapped behind corrupted access protocols. Central banking requires one fundamental ability: the power to move money. That power had been surgically removed. The most powerful financial institution on earth had been reduced to a conference room of economists with working phones and no levers to pull. By evening of day one, gas stations had become flashpoints. Pumps wouldn't activate without payment authorization. The few stations with old mechanical pumps were overrun. Lines stretched 2 miles. Fistfights erupted over 5-gallon purchases. Police responded, but squad car computers were dead. Dispatch systems were silent. Officers operated on visual patrol and citizen flag downs, like cops from the 1940s. In Los Angeles, a station owner tried charging $50 per gallon, cash only. The crowd didn't riot. They simply took the gas and left money they decided was fair. Spontaneous price controls enforced by exhausted people who understood the world had changed and old rules no longer held weight. Pharmacies faced the cruelest mathematics. Prescription databases were inaccessible. Pharmacists couldn't verify dosages, interactions, or refill schedules. Controlled substances sat in safes behind regulations requiring electronic tracking, now impossible to maintain. A pharmacy in Atlanta made a decision that would be repeated nationwide. They unlocked the cabinets and handed out insulin to diabetics on trust. No verification, no payment, just handwritten names and addresses. It was triage, choosing who would live through the week while praying the systems would return before someone died from an unlogged drug interaction. The pharmacist's hands shook as she wrote each name. She was violating federal law with every bottle. And she kept writing. Day 2 began with a new realization spreading through the population. This wasn't a disruption. This was dissolution. Water pressure dropped as treatment plants lost automation. Engineers manually operated valves designed for software control. But water systems are complex ecosystems of chemical balance and pressure regulation. Without real-time monitoring, treatment became guesswork. By midday, 17 cities issued boil water advisories. But half the population had no power to boil anything. People filled bathtubs and sinks, hoarding water like gold. Public fountains were drained dry. Neighbors who had never spoken began negotiating over garden hoses. Water, the most abundant resource in American infrastructure, became currency overnight. The banking system remained frozen. ATMs were dark monuments to a lost age. Inside bank headquarters, IT teams worked around the clock, trying to isolate and remove malware that had integrated into core systems like cancer and bone marrow. Every attempt to restore one system triggered failures in 3 others. The code was designed to metastasize, spreading deeper with each attempted cure. Security experts recognized the signature. This wasn't ransomware seeking payment. This was scorched earth programming. The attackers didn't want money. They wanted collapse, and they had achieved it with terrifying precision. Credit became a ghost. The entire concept of buy now, pay later requires institutional memory, databases that track who owes what to whom. Without those records, credit ceased to exist. A mortgage holder in Dallas couldn't prove her house was paid off. A car owner in Seattle couldn't verify his loan was current. Debt and ownership became matters of paper records most people didn't keep. Lawyers predicted decades of litigation once systems returned. But for now, property existed in a strange quantum state, owned and unowned simultaneously. The entire apparatus of modern finance, built on ledger entries and credit scores, had been reduced to handshake deals and written IOUs. Food supply is critical by day 2. America imports 43% of its fresh fruit and 56% of its vegetables. Those supply chains cross borders requiring digital customs processing. At the Mexican border, trucks sat loaded with tomatoes and avocados rotting in 100-degree heat. Customs agents had no way to process manifests. The food sat 50 yards from empty grocery stores, separated by bureaucratic systems that required computers nobody could operate. Similar scenes played at every port. Container ships anchored offshore, packed with goods that paperwork couldn't release. Abundance existed everywhere, except where people could reach it. Hospitals entered crisis mode as generator fuel ran low. Most facilities kept 72 hours of diesel. That deadline approached with no resupply possible. Fuel trucks couldn't navigate, couldn't verify delivery, couldn't process payment. Administrators made impossible choices: which buildings to keep powered, which patients to move, which equipment to shut down. A hospital in Chicago began manually ventilating patients in 4-hour shifts. Nurses squeezed bags by hand, counting breaths, spelling each other like sailors on watch. Their arms cramped and shook. They kept squeezing, because stopping meant death, and death wasn't acceptable just because computers failed. The government's response revealed its own fragility. FEMA relied on digital coordination systems now dark. The military could deploy, but logistics ran on the same corrupted networks paralyzing civilian infrastructure. Generals accustomed to satellite coordination found themselves planning supply routes on paper maps. Convoy routes planned on computers took hours to draft by hand. By the time orders reached field units, situations had changed. The world's most powerful military was learning what every army before the digital age knew. Speed and flexibility required trust in subordinates, not central control. They adapted, but adaptation takes time, and people were dying in the gap. Social media's absence created an information vacuum worse than the blackout itself. Without Twitter, Facebook, or news apps, rumors filled the void. Some neighborhoods believed it was localized. Others thought nuclear war had started. Conspiracy theories spread person to person like viruses through medieval villages. The lack of authoritative information became its own disaster. People made decisions based on fear and assumption. Some fled cities on foot, draining their resources for evacuations that weren't necessary. Others stayed in dangerous situations, believing help was coming that would never arrive. Information had been free and infinite for so long that its absence felt like blindness. By day 3, a new economy emerged from the ruins. Barter systems appeared spontaneously. Batteries for water, canned food for gasoline, medical supplies for security. Markets formed in parking lots and parks, goods spread on blankets like medieval fairs. Prices fluctuated wildly based on desperation and supply. A D battery worth $1 on day 0 traded for $5 in food on day 3. Cigarettes became universal currency among those who had them. The invisible hand of the market still functioned, but it was a different hand now. Rougher, older, more honest about scarcity. This was economics without the digital veneer. Raw exchange between people who could see each other's eyes. The total economic damage by 72 hours crossed $4 trillion. But that number was almost meaningless. How do you calculate the cost when the calculating systems are destroyed? The stock market losses could be tallied eventually. But what about the insulin-dependent diabetic who died on day 2? What about the small business that would never reopen because 3 days without revenue meant bankruptcy? What about the psychological damage to a generation of children who watched their parents panic? Some costs appear in spreadsheets. Others appear in therapy sessions 20 years later. International consequences rippled outward like concentric circles from an explosion. The dollar had been the world's reserve currency, backed not by gold, but by the full faith and credit of the United States government. That faith had been executed on digital infrastructure, now revealed as catastrophically vulnerable. Within 72 hours, China and Russia announced a joint digital currency backed by gold reserves. The European Union accelerated plans for financial independence from American systems. The dollar didn't collapse, but its dominance cracked in ways that wouldn't be repaired for decades. Economic power, like trust, takes generations to build and days to shatter. Recovery would require 18 months of continuous work. Every system had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Banks restored from backup servers that were themselves decades out of date. The gap between backup and present had to be reconstructed transaction by transaction, a digital archaeology of recent history. Power grids were manually reset, each substation requiring technicians to physically override corrupted systems. Water treatment plants operated on emergency protocols for 11 months. The American economy, the most complex machine ever built, had to be reassembled by hand while still trying to function. The congressional inquiry that followed identified the attack's origin, but the details remained classified. What became public was this: the malware had been present in American systems for 8 months before activation. 8 months of silent presence, mapping networks, identifying vulnerabilities, waiting for the optimal moment. The attackers had turned America's complexity against itself. Every connection designed for efficiency became a pathway for infection. Every automated system became a potential weapon. The very features that made modern infrastructure powerful had made it fatally brittle. The final cost exceeded $7 trillion. But sovereignty is solvency, and America had been rendered insolvent for 72 hours, not bankrupt in the traditional sense. Something stranger, a nation with wealth it couldn't access, assets it couldn't prove existed, the richest country in history brought to its knees not by poverty, but by the inability to verify its own prosperity. The ledger hadn't been destroyed, it had been scrambled. And in an economy built entirely on digital ledgers, scrambled might as well be gone. Think about the scale of that. $7 trillion. America's entire World War II effort, adjusted for inflation, cost $4.7 trillion. This attack, executed by perhaps 24 programmers over 18 months, inflicted more economic damage than the largest military conflict in human history. No bombs, no soldiers, just code. The return on investment for the attackers was incalculable. Every dollar spent on development had yielded millions in damage. It was the most cost-effective act of warfare ever documented. The lesson carved into America's economic memory was brutal but clear. Digital dependence creates digital fragility. Every system connected to the Internet is a potential target. Every automated process is a hostage to the code that runs it. The efficiency that made America wealthy had made it vulnerable in ways that couldn't be defended with aircraft carriers or missiles. Economic power in the 21st century requires redundancy, not optimization, backup systems, analog alternatives, the ability to function when the lights go out and the servers go dark. Families who survived the 72 hours with least trauma shared common traits. They had stored water and food, not for disaster preparation, but from habit. They kept cash at home because they remembered when ATMs weren't everywhere. They knew their neighbors' names and could coordinate without phones. These weren't survivalists or preppers. They were simply people who had maintained analog skills in a digital world. Navigation by landmarks.